Good morning. Welcome to another Medtech webinar, Setting Up for Success, How Medtech Companies Are Streamlining Operations with Risk-Based Strategies. My name is Nicole Owens, and I'm the Director of Marketing Communications for Medtech. If you're not familiar with Medtech, we are a trade association for medical device companies and those that work with medical device companies in the New England area. And we work to bolster the ecosystem through education, events like this, connection, advocacy, and awareness. Just a real quick housekeeping note, please feel free to utilize the Q&A function in the bar below during the webinar. We will have some time at the end of the webinar allocated to Q&A, so please make sure you feed in your questions. Now, without further ado, I would love to welcome our host for today's webinar, Metadata, and I'm going to turn it over to our speakers for today, Jana Hajdukovic and Brian Barnes. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. We're very excited to be here with Medtech to discuss the shift that we're seeing in the clinical research industry, in which medical device organizations are increasingly adopting a holistic technology approach to streamlining their clinical trial monitoring and risk-based oversight strategies. Now, the shift that we're seeing, it's largely been driven by the recognition from global regulatory agencies who have highlighted the importance for clinical operations to implement risk-based strategies that focus oversight on the most important aspects of study conduct, which is to improve patient safety and data quality in clinical trials. In support of the evolving regulatory landscape, medtech organizations are increasingly taking a risk-based, fit-for-purpose approach in the use of technology to conduct their trials, as the traditional approaches are no longer sustainable or effective. Risk-based quality management, when backed by a comprehensive, scalable, and thoughtful technology, enables faster data access with quality checks, enables proactive and early detection of errors and risks, all while protecting trial participants and ensuring improved data quality and integrity for the trial life cycle. So today we're going to highlight the risk-based quality management framework technology that supports these strategies. So with that, Brian, do you want to give a brief introduction of yourself?
Hi, Jana. Thanks so much. Yeah, really appreciate everyone's attendance to the webinar today. I'm Brian Barnes, Senior Director within our Research and Development and the Clinical Operations Technology set at Medidata. Prior to joining Medidata just over 2.5 years ago, I spent 16 years in the CRO space, really working on risk-based quality management and RBM practices and principles, really helping operationalize the quality by design practices that we'll be talking about today.
And I'm Jana Hajdukovic. I'm a senior manager within Medidata's global compliance and strategy function. We're really responsible for all things quality and regulatory at Medidata. So on the quality side, it's really making sure that we've got a quality management system that meets our needs, our customer needs, and the industry that we serve. And then on the regulatory side, it's interpreting regulatory guidance, regulations, and making sure that our products and services are compliant, but also using a lot of our industry partnerships and direct relationships with regulators to continue to promote the use of technology to bring innovation to the life sciences industry. So for our agenda today, we're going to start with an introduction to Medidata and the platform and services that we offer to medical device companies to support your clinical trials. We'll discuss the evolving regulatory landscape as it relates to risk-based quality management principles throughout your life cycle, your clinical trial life cycle. We'll showcase the quality by design framework that supports risk-based strategies. Then we're going to demo Medidata's risk management template, which we've specifically developed for medical device organizations to help you identify, document, and measure the risks of a study protocol and devise an appropriate monitoring plan for your study. And then we'll go into a deeper dive into the various strategies that support an effective and holistic risk-based quality management adoption. So Medidata, we're most prominently known for Raven in the EDC management space, but we actually have our solutions address the entire clinical trial process holistically rather than just supporting discrete activities. Our platform is the life science industry's only unified platform addressing the entire clinical research process, from study setup and planning all the way through conduct and completion. So within our platform, we've got our patient cloud suite of applications, and those are really designed to make it simple and engaging for participants, for patients to participate in a trial. So your trials are faster, easier, and produce better results. Then we've got our Rave data management suite of applications, which really are designed to eliminate complex manual processes and deliver higher quality data for faster insights. The area that we're going to focus on today is our Rave clinical operations suite of applications, and those drive efficiencies, agility, and decentralization of study execution with integrated site, investigator, and sponsor workflows, embedded analytic insights, and real-time data availability. And finally, we've got our Acorn AI, which that combines our largest clinical trial data set with a unified platform, advanced analytics, and deep human expertise to uncover breakthrough insights. But with our platform, what we really think is the differentiator is that our solutions or our platform, it all sits in the same environment and shares the same data. The data strategy that underpins all of our products, all of our analytics and our platform, and really how we think we're moving the industry forward. The strategy that we call that our data fabric strategy. And that really allows us to deliver a full suite of solutions in a single platform environment, giving you the ultimate flexibility and control over your data. You can ingest data from external sources, including lab data, real world data, or data from other non-metadata applications, and use it in our applications in the same data environment. You're also able to extract data from our cloud platform and use it for your own analysis or storage in internal systems. So like I said, today, we're going to focus on the clinical operations space and highlight how an effective and integrated holistic approach rather than siloed versions of applications can efficiently help you execute your risk-based management, your risk-based quality management strategies while maintaining regulatory compliance. So Medidata, we've actually been supporting medical device manufacturers with their trials for over 15 years. In fact, our first medical device trial was an inhaler study that was conducted in 2006. So we have a wide breadth of experience in supporting medical device companies. We work with 9 out of the top 10 medical device companies are on our platform. We've supported over 784 trials. We work with 18,000 sites and have 184 different medical device sponsors. We've enrolled over 326,000 patients on our platform, and we've got 30,000 active users in 1,000 connected hospitals. So again, we're very active in the medical device space, and we're continuing to see our scope of work and partnerships with these companies grow and expand. So onto the regulatory evolution of risk-based quality management. Risk-based management in clinical trials, it's not new to the industry. Back in 2013, the FDA and EMA provided their initial feedback on how important risk-based monitoring is in clinical trials. Essentially, these guidances encourage sponsors to use technology and real-time information to proactively monitor risks and identify issues to support decision-making. In 2015, Transcelerate published a position paper, and they really created a framework for implementation, which advised clinical operations and study teams to evaluate risk from numerous standpoints through the use of technology. Starting in 2016, regulatory agencies such as FDA and the EMA and ICH, they began to recommend a risk-based approach for clinical studies. In 2016, ICH E6R2, a revision to the Good Clinical Practice, updated its guidelines to really support innovation and encourage the wide-scale use of risk-based monitoring that we think is best addressed through a larger RBQM framework. ICH E6R2 really, it codified the expectation for a risk-based monitoring approach and states that sponsors should develop a systematic, prioritized, risk-based approach to monitoring clinical trials. It also states that sponsors must implement a system to manage quality throughout all trial stages and focus on the essential activities. In March 2018, the FDA officially placed ICHE 6R2 in the Federal Registry, which made the explicit responsibility of the sponsor to understand the risk to quality in clinical trials through the use of an RBQM approach. Building on ICHE 6R2, ICHE 8R1, too many acronyms, general considerations for clinical trials. It introduced the idea of quality by design and the need to identify critical to quality factors to protect subjects and generate reliable and meaningful data. And more importantly, the management of those risks using a risk proportionate proactive approach. In 2017, the medical device regulation entered into force, and it had a staggered transitional period, becoming effective ultimately in May 2021. Now, the MDR, as we all know, it triggered significant changes to the regulatory landscape for medical devices, and it added new requirements for clinical investigations in that medical device companies were now subject to similar clinical trial standards as drug manufacturers. The MDR, it placed more scrutiny on clinical evidence and new and tighter criteria for demonstrating equivalence. And what this did is it results in more clinical data that must be obtained from clinical investigations of the device. The MDR also requires that clinical investigations are conducted in accordance with GCP, and it directly references the ISO 14155 standard, which is GCP for medical devices. It includes the addition of clinical risk management as the manufacturer's responsibility, meaning that your quality management system has to expand to include clinical operations. ISO 14155, the standard, it establishes the need for developing a risk management plan throughout the product life cycle and incorporating it into your clinical investigation plan before the study begins. Another welcomed update with the revision to ISO 14155 is that it allows for risk-based monitoring and is more in line with ICHE 6R2. Also, the FDA draft guidance for risk-based monitoring and their risk-based approach to clinical investigations. The risk assessment that you complete during RBQM, it's really meant to determine the appropriate risk-based monitoring plan and should support your rationale for determining that. It also made manufacturers responsible for devices after approval, as under the MDR, both pre and post-market clinical studies count as clinical investigations. So this really extended the requirement to comply with GCP to post-market trials. Post-market risk-based monitoring and risk-based management activities are essential and should be implemented through an RBQM approach. So there was a lot of changes in the regulatory landscape, and sponsors, manufacturers, they were already busy working on their implementations of RBQM. But then COVID-19 hit, and it really drastically changed the way trials were conducted. It truly was a catalyst that prompted sponsors to intentionally embrace the adoption of an RBQM framework for new and ongoing trials. Numerous global regulatory agencies issued guidances that supported this adoption during the pandemic, and we really think that we'll take these learnings beyond. So as you can see, and you've likely experienced over the past years, regulations for the medical device industry, they've continued to place more emphasis on the things that matter the most when conducting trials, and that's the clinical data and patient safety. Recent updates to regulatory guidances and standards are encouraging life sciences companies to step up their risk management efforts by incorporating risk-based thinking into their entire quality management system. And they're also encouraging the use of a fit-for-purpose technology adoption to achieve this. It's also explicitly called out in the draft ICHE 6R3 revision. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brian to start breaking down some of these frameworks and risk-based approach to trials that the regulators have truly embraced.
Thanks so much, Jana, for the overview of kind of some of the regulatory landscape that we've seen. So we'll kind of transition at this point now to focusing on how do we start applying these practices and principles into our operation strategies and day-to-day activities as well. So if you want to jump to the next slide, Jana, what we really build from a framework of a quality management process, as we talked about with ICH E6 R2 and E8 R1, talked about critical to quality factors and a quality by design approach. But what does that really start to bring out as a value add? And we always like to circle back to kind of referencing the classic plan, do, check, act sequence of quality by design. And that really starts with good planning section or phase up front, which is beginning in that foundation of a risk assessment, which is then driving those downstream monitoring strategies that we'll talk about in further detail in a couple of slides. But then as we go into the do section, that's where we start to see those monitoring activities take place. So historically, what may have been on-site monitoring, but now as we start to look at some of the impact that COVID had and where we're seeing in kind of the evolution of risk-based quality management is more remote monitoring and centralized monitoring capabilities that are becoming available. But after we start doing the activities and we put those plans in place, it's really important that we check back using metrics and data to really drive and determine the effectiveness of the strategies that we've put forward. So being able to measure the effectiveness using metrics such as KRIs or key risk indicators or QTLs or quality tolerance limits, those are great opportunities for us to measure, are the mechanisms that we've put in place, are those being effective? And if they're not, that we make adjustments during that acting phase. And that's where that ongoing oversight really is a key component of the risk assessment process, is making adjustments, adjusting or adding those monitoring strategies as we start to get that feedback from the metrics. So next slide, Jana. I think Transcelerate came out with a great paper in 2020 that kind of highlighted a little bit of a framework to starting to put this in place. And I really wanted to highlight here where we start to see at the beginning phase, the quality by design principles that we talked about, those plan, do, check, act. And those are really helping us understand what are the critical to quality factors. And we'll show you within the demo today, within the risk management application that Metadata has available today, is really focusing on the data that matters most. So what are truly the data points and processes that are impactful for the successful execution and operation of that study? Those are your critical to quality factors, and those are those critical data and processes. And we'll show you where collecting those and really having that cross-functional collaboration about what matters most and how we're effectively managing those throughout the life cycle of the study is really critical. And then the risk control mechanisms, I talked about it in that and that acting section is what are the monitoring mechanisms that we're putting in place? So how are we using centralized statistical monitoring, or how are we using some of those new technologies that we're seeing evolve in the decentralized space? How are we applying those to our studies and really using them as mechanisms to control the risks that we've identified? And then again, at the bottom are those key risk indicators and quality tolerance limits as that foundational metric oversight piece. So we've seen a lot of success and adoption of these practices, and we'll show you some of that data here in a moment. Next slide. So how do we start to put some of these in practice? We talked a little bit about the framework, what the bigger structure of a quality management perspective looks like, but how do we start operationalizing that? How do we start to operationalize that at a study specific level? And how do we start empowering each of those clinical teams to really put these practices into place? And to do that, it really, ICH E6 R2 provided a great framework within section 5.0, talking about quality management. And they outlined a great 5-step process to really start putting these practices into place. That first step is the identification of those critical to quality factors, of those critical data and processes. It's getting cross-functional buy-in and participation and engagement about what are the critical data points that are truly impactful for that study, making sure that's clearly outlined from the beginning cross-functionally, that everybody understands that, and that everybody is laser focused on driving that deliverable to the end. Once we've identified those, it's putting those risks or thinking about the risks that are associated to those critical data and critical processes. So what are the components or things that could start to jeopardize or impact the quality of the data? Those are the risks that we want to focus on. So we often kind of talk about, using a risk proportionate approach. So then being able to use the impact, probability, and detectability rating to really understand a potential risk score so that we can evaluate those risks that are more impactful for us, and that we can allocate our resources accordingly and focus on those activities that are really going to impact the quality of the data the most. So that's where that identification is really critical. And once we've done those and prioritize those risks, so weighting the risks of those that are going to bring us the greatest harm or potential impact, then we start to think about those control mechanisms. And those control mechanisms are the mitigations that we talked about. Those are typically those monitoring strategies, or it could be some use of a different technology that could deliver a different data perspective or feed to that endpoint or to that risk control mechanism. So again, identifying how are we going to start to manage these. And then we move to step 4 is the communication and review. Cross-functional collaboration is paramount. I think historically in clinical trials, we developed a little bit of a siloed mentality. As we start to engage against different cross-functional stakeholders, and we have different velocity of data coming in and volume of data, we really need to start to share and communicate better. So we need a shared platform and the ability to share where we're seeing and how we're adjusting our monitoring activities, and then be able to communicate effectively on an ongoing basis across our teams with that. And then to wrap up, that 5th step is the reporting. So being able to demonstrate that oversight or demonstrate this process of oversight is important. So being able to have and generate a risk plan report or some type of output to document how your thought process evolved and how your monitoring strategies evolved over time is really that last part. So, we've seen a lot of success working with customers where historically, these types of activities would have been captured in meeting minutes or some type of email. And when we're trying to recreate those activities in a potential audit inspection, we're going across all of our organization to try to understand and piece that together. That all needs to be in one location. And a risk plan report is a great location to kind of track what actions got taken, why did those get taken for those particular issues, and have that in a central location to be able to share during those oversight or inspection areas. Next slide, Jana. And as we start to think about how this fits into those, trial activities, looking at both pre-trial and ongoing is an important part. So both risk management and quality by design principles really occur at the very early or pre-protocol development stage. So one of the big pieces and components that we try to bring out in that quality by design framework is being proactive. So designing quality into the protocol from the beginning. And that's where I'll show you in the demonstration today where being able to use a risk categorization activity or tool set to really think about the areas or categories of risk that could impact that protocol and design those components into the protocol early. So rather than trying to build and make protocol amendments later, is really to think proactively into that protocol design from the beginning. And then as we start to go into the ongoing trial activities, we'll show you then where we leverage those critical to quality factors, those critical data and processes, and oversee those throughout the life cycle of the study. So being able to continuously monitor those and see how our mitigations and metrics are changing and evolving throughout the life cycle of the study. So both quality by design is really important during those pre-trial activities by designing quality into the protocol early, and then in the post-trial or ongoing trial activities, rather than trying to monitor quality is really trying to understand how we can oversee that throughout the life cycle of the study. And I'll show you a little bit of how we are able to operationalize that within a tool and application here in a moment. So with Jana, one more slide, and that should take us to some of the data to really kind of show you where industry is evolving and adapting. So we have been talking about quality by design really for a while now. But it wasn't until really the COVID-19 pandemic that we really started to see industry adoption start to uptick. So there's the ACRO is the Association of Clinical Research Organizations, which is a trade organization of both CROs or contract research organizations and technology member companies. Medidata has an opportunity to participate within the risk-based quality management working group within ACRO. And we just are in the process of finalizing and publishing our recent landscape survey data. And I wanted to take a brief moment today to kind of show you some of that industry adoption since 2019, really pre-COVID pandemic, of these risk-based quality management components, or those quality by design principles that we've been talking about. So you'll see really the strong adoption of risk management, which we're excited to kind of see. And as Janet talked about in the beginning, it's really unlocking really the oversight capabilities throughout the life cycle of the study. And then now using these, we're able to unlock the different components of risk-based quality management, such as QTLs, KRIs, centralized statistical monitoring, remote or offsite monitoring, and then those reduced SDV, SDR capabilities. So really appreciating that flexibility is the key, that oftentimes we don't see all of these practices, and especially on medical device studies, understanding that they're in a little bit different case than some of our normal pharma trials that we traditionally have seen, but understanding some of the unique characteristics of med device companies and how we can fit these capabilities into the med device specific trials as well. And then if you want to go to one more slide, Jana, I'll go ahead and take control as well. And we want to take a quick pause and do a quick poll for today's audience. And what we wanted to understand is what or how often are you utilizing these risk-based monitoring practices today in your clinical trial? So you'll see the poll pop up from the screen here in a moment. And if you could just take a moment to offer us some perspective about what types of frequencies you're implementing these right now. So A would be all the time, B would be frequently, C occasionally, or D currently not applying these types of practices on your trial. So we'll go ahead and give everybody a moment to answer, and then we'll go ahead and take a peek at the results today. And while we're waiting for those results to come in, I did want to take the opportunity to thank you for joining today's presentation and looking forward to seeing our results. So Nicole will give everyone just a moment longer to answer. And then if you don't mind, go ahead and if you're able to share some of the results with the group, we can start to see how our colleagues on the line today are utilizing some of these practices. So good responses. So happy to see a little bit of a balance, actually. So we see some all the times, which is great, about 30%, which actually matches a lot of that survey data I just showed you from ACRO, which is exciting. Jan, I don't know what some of your thoughts are there, but I think we're seeing some of that balance. About 30% of those trials are starting to implement some of those. But what I'm taking away, what is it? Check my math here, 70%, I think, at least occasionally apply some of these, which is exciting to see. Great. Thanks so much for your participation there. We do have 2 more polls coming up just in a couple of moments, so be ready to continue to share that feedback. So what I'd like to do, we've talked about a little bit of the regulatory landscape and what that looked like at the beginning. I shared some perspective about how we start to operationalize those from a theoretical conceptual framework side. What I want to do now is jump in to show you what does this look like in some practice principles today. So within metadata, we offer an application called risk management. And risk management is a new technology or application of those quality by design principles that we talked about. And we really tailored this to follow that 5-step process that we outlined within section 5.0 in ICHE 6R2. And we break that into really 2 key pillars of risk management. The first is focusing on the risk categorization template, and I'll talk about that here in a moment. And then the second one is those quality by design principles, those critical data, critical processes that we highlighted. But what I want to show you within that risk categorization, and this we find a lot of success during that early protocol development phase. So thinking about what are the key categories of risk that or categories or components of the study that you really want to focus on during that protocol development phase, and how can you think about building quality into the protocol from the beginning. So what we do within the metadata environment is we offer a pre-configured medical device risk categorization template, really focused on the unique characteristics of the med device space. So what are the different categories of the trial components that are really impactful for med device? We offer a number of additional pre-configured risk categorization assessment templates as well. For those that are familiar with Transcelerate, they offered a paper back in 2015 that gave a template. We have that pre-configured as well. But we also offer complete flexibility if or when companies start to evolve and create their own templates, we can customize those within the application as well. So what you'll see here is an example of kind of the different categories of assessment that we have within our template for the med device space. looking at complexity all the way down to vendor assessments. From here, we're able to then evaluate an impact using the probability impact and detectability scales on a 1 to 3 basis of each of the different categories. What is that potential score? But then to really help and drive the conversations cross-functionally within each of the groups, what we do here is offer questions for discussion. And these are some examples of things that we just want to bring up as conversation, areas that we've noticed with our engagements that could bring risk or consideration to different protocol designs. So you can see those kind of outlined here. We can use probability, impact, and detectability to rate each of those categories as well, but then ultimately start to think about the risks that are associated to each of those categories. And as those groups are kind of communicating and talking to each other, we're able to pull out those risks that we saw within the second step of that 5-step process. And we can start to pull those out and document those and have those discussions with the cross-functional team. So in this example, this is a med device study, and we looked at how the protocol may have multiple time points for measurement in like a post-injection era. So we can document the different risks, give a little bit of a description about those risks, start to think about where that data is located. And as we start to use the third step of that 5-step process is that evaluation. So looking at, again, the probability, impact, and detectability, and measure that score and quantify how much potential impact it might have on the individual scale, which would then again help us into prioritizing those risks that bring us the greatest impact. And then also within this section, we're able to start thinking about those risk control mechanisms as well. So if it rates really high, we can start looking at how do we use or implement the different components of monitoring to really start to strategically attack and focus our efforts on those areas. So in this case, you can see during on-site monitoring, maybe we're going to do some activities during a site initiation visit and document those within the monitoring plan. So again, these activities are documented in a central location. They're not in an Excel sheet. And they're not in emails or meeting minutes, someplace that's really hard for us to recreate and pull those, or not even be available for us to use as we're creating those different functional plans. And then as we start to think about those measurements, so thinking about plan, do, check, act, how are we going to measure the effectiveness of these mitigation strategies? So here you can see we can start to identify and target specific key risk indicators and quality tolerance limits specifically focused on those different individual risks. Where I now want to pivot to is that second component of the quality by design principles, which is those critical to quality factors. So here you can see where we start to look at the critical data and critical processes. And what I did is outline a couple of sample critical data points from a med device study and areas that are primarily focused on those primary or secondary endpoints of that study. So you can see here, we're able to list out what are all the important measurements that we want the team to focus on. What are those data points that are truly critical to the successful implementation of that study? And following that same process of identifying the corresponding risks, we can jump in and then identify risks that are associated to those critical critical data points here as well. So you can see if one of our critical data points is, a peak gradient, one of the risks might be a particular calculation method for that gradient. So maybe from past historical studies, maybe we had inconsistency in how those calculations were done. So here we can talk about that as a risk, maybe outline what the equation is that we'll use, make sure that everybody's trained and aligned on that. And then we can then look at what are some potential mechanisms that we can use to really make sure that those are being followed up on. An example here that we see is using focused targeted source data verification. Maybe we want to use source data verification or source data review to make sure those calculations are being done by the sites correctly. And that maybe we even utilize some centralized monitoring capabilities to perform biweekly reviews of what are those average flow rates, just to make sure that we're seeing those consistently aligned and that we're not alarmed at the end of a study by some type of miscalculation that may be jeopardizing that potential endpoint for the study. And again, being able to use some key risk indicators to measure that effectiveness there. And let me show you one example very quickly. Follow the same process for critical processes as well. So what you're able to see here is thinking about what are the processes associated to the collection of those critical data points, and how can we make sure that those are being effectively communicated. So oftentimes we see severe adverse events as a critical process. So making sure that we're consistent in how we're collecting and documenting those as well. So again, what risk management offers is a very nice streamlined application within a single source of truth to operationalize the workflow of this risk assessment process to really help our teams come together in a collaborative space to really pull that together. And what this really generates then at the end is we talked about what does it look like in terms of generating a risk plan report. So we're able to jump in and then generate a risk plan report that is able to then be filed within the electronic trial master file or whatever filing system you have, or even be made available in terms of an audit inspection. So you can show clearly what you identified to be critical to the study. So here you can see those critical data and critical processes, that associated risk categorization review that you performed. And then what we'll be able to see at the bottom are what are some of those risks that we identified in that inventory section. So within a single location, we can start to see what risks we identified, what we did about them, how we evaluated with them, and then what actions we took as a result as well. So again, as we're developing those functional plans, we have a single source of truth to make sure that we did what we said we were going to do in terms of the operatization of those risk assessment processes. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a brief demonstration of how do we start putting those practices together that we kind of talked about in those early sections of today's presentation. So what I want to turn to now is kind of thinking about how do we put these into practice? So what you saw here is really a closed loop risk management process. So thinking about critical data and processes and using those to really enable those risk control mechanisms and using a single source of truth for that. What you're able to see is kind of where we start to optimize the source data verification approaches. So we have aligned communication on what are those critical data and processes, and specifically how are we focusing our monitoring efforts on that. And then we tied in that connection to central monitoring. So if there's any type of oversight mechanism centrally that we can use to oversee that, we have a single source to really document that as well. And then how do we design flexible remote monitoring capabilities as well? One of the biggest enhancements or capabilities we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic was the use of remote source document capabilities as well. So we were excited to kind of see how we're able to start to share some of those documents that are available historically only traditionally on site. How can we share those in a secure environment remotely to really enable some of those ongoing and more proactive monitoring activities as well? So that is how we start to really unlock those risk-based quality management principles that we've seen historically from ICG 6R2 and E8R1 as well. Now I want to kind of pause for the second poll. So we had great participation in that first section. So I want to see, Nicole, if you can bring up our second poll for today. We want to look at how would you classify your organization's current adoption of these quality by design practices. So kind of seeing what we've talked about in the principles and practices so far. Would you say that you have no plans to adapt these? Are you currently exploring or not yet adopted those? Maybe you're in an early adoption phase or moving into an implementation practice. Or hopefully you're in a fully adopted and implementation stage as well. So I want to pause if you could give us just a quick little idea about where's your organizational and adoption practice at the present time. So give everyone just 1 or 2 more seconds to go ahead and answer that question. And then Nicole, if you can go ahead and show us the results of that one. All right, I think that's exciting. So I think there's a nice little balance between exploration, maybe not yet adapting, and some implementation. So I think the exciting thing for me here is there's no plan. So I think everybody's kind of seeing the value of adopting some of these principles, which is really, I think, kind of what the regulatory bodies are pushing us. Hopefully today's webinar is helping you in that exploration phase to kind of understand some of the capabilities that are available within the market today to help you on that path, and then really enable you to continue that successful implementation as well. And for those that didn't answer fully adopted, I think that's very consistent with what we're seeing in the industry as well. And I don't think really anybody is ever fully adopted and implementing. I think it's always a growth phase as well. So I'm really excited to kind of see those results today as well. So with that kind of reflecting on the second poll, what I want to start to kind of show you is a little bit of what are some of the success metrics that you might be able to gain kind of with some of these practices that we've talked about. So I want to share a little bit of the experience that Medidata has in this space. Currently with our med device customers, you know, we often kind of hear sometimes where in the med device space, maybe some of these targeted source data verification capabilities aren't applicable, but really we have over 18 med device sponsors that utilize these capabilities on studies today. What they're able to generate, and this is data that we've been able to look at over 2,000 studies that we've operationalized the RAVE TSTV capability since 2014. That really started to demonstrate a 33% savings, which can equate to almost 4 monitoring days on site per year. And when we start to reduce those on-site monitoring visits, that's where we start to see really those cost savings starts to come into play, and then also start to see some of the quality by design practices as well. And with that, you know, we also are you know, having 10% of all of our studies right now are utilizing some of, or med device studies are utilizing some of these capabilities. So what I want to close you with today is just a little bit more experience where Medidata has in this space, thinking about some of the thought leadership that we shared earlier with ACRO, and some of the engagements that we've had with Transcelerate as well. And then looking at, you know, where we start to continue to partner with industry moving forward. So with that, I want to pause and see, Jan, if you had any additional thoughts or questions that have come into the discussion so far.
Yeah, so we do have some questions. The first question, for companies who are just thinking about adopting their processes towards risk-based, how would you suggest starting?
Sorry, I had to get a sip there of water, so I was buying myself a little bit of second there. Thanks, Jenna. So I think the first step that I would take is, again, taking that risk assessment up front, and I'm open to your thoughts as well. But I think just taking that risk assessment and thinking about, you know, what is important to each study, and then starting that as a focus point as well. So yeah, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that really drives your overall strategy and is really the input into all of the downstream processes. So the risk assessment is likely your most important tool for that. Another question, what are the components of a successful remote monitoring strategy?
Yeah, I think some of the components that we see is really thinking about where the data is located. I think number one. So I think we talked about it within that risk assessment, is thinking about where the data is located and how the data is coming in. One of the key things that we think about is active and passive data. So as we start to see, you know, different data sources and the changes of data sources coming, thinking about where the data is located and how it's coming in is really, I think, a key component of those remote monitoring practices. So once, you know, as we start to see greater accessibility of data remotely, I think we're able to then start to leverage some of those capabilities that we talked about before, such as remote source document review, centralized statistical monitoring, and then just, you know, engagements with sites remotely, focusing on quality improvements.
Another question, what really defines the difference between risk-based monitoring and risk-based quality management?
That's a great question. And I think maybe one that we should have started from the beginning. Maybe I use those a little bit too interchangeably, but if I could summarize it kind of in a nutshell, risk-based quality management is a more holistic framework. So what that is thinking about an overall quality a quality management system-based approach. So I think system would be the key thing. So when you're looking at all the different mechanisms that are in play in terms of the different quality components of an organization. So risk assessment could be one of those. Of those, risk-based monitoring is one of those, but also kind of your oversight and audit capabilities as well. So there's a number of different components that fall into that kind of quality management system umbrella. But within that umbrella, RBM or risk-based monitoring is one of those. And RBM is kind of what you would traditionally think of as like remote source document or reduced SDV, SDR, centralized statistical monitoring, for example. those are control mechanisms that would fit under a risk-based quality management umbrella. So I think the best summary, again, RBQM is an overall risk-based approach, and an RBM are the tools or capabilities that we're able to utilize or leverage within that space.
Yeah, so if any of the participants have questions, you can use the Q&A or the chat function. We're able to see them in both.
And while we wait for a couple of more questions to come in, what I'd like to turn to is maybe our last poll for today. So as we start to think about how well did we do today? Do you feel more prepared in thinking about quality by design principles following today's discussion as we started to look at some of those poll results as well in that evolving stage? Do you feel more prepared thinking about quality by design and some of the capabilities that are available as a choice? So if you're able to share just a quick yes or no with us today, we won't show these. This is a little bit of metrics for us to see if we were successful in helping you on that path in your journey today in delivering those quality by design principles. So kind of looking at the chats, I don't see that we have too many other ones left. Jana, do you see anything else that we needed to take care of today?
I have not seen anything else pop up, but if there are additional questions, both Brian and my email addresses are up on there. We'd be happy to answer any follow-up questions you have or talk with you about implementing risk-based strategies at your organizations.
Yep. Thanks so much, Jana. Thanks for sharing your perspective today on the regulatory landscape, and looking forward to seeing everybody at a future MassMedic webinar as well. So Nicole, I'll go ahead and hand to you if you had any other closing thoughts for today's session.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Jana. Great webinar. Hope everyone who attended live enjoyed it. Everyone who registered will get the copy of this recording after the fact. And, you know, we just want to take the opportunity again to thank Metadata as our sponsor. We cannot do educational opportunities like this without support from sponsors and members. So thank you very much. We encourage you to go to massmedic.com and see our full list of upcoming events. And like Brian said, we look forward to seeing you at a future event. Thanks. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.